importance of the Juderia of Toledo is that it adds a clear contrast to what later became the dominant narrative of Spanish history, which was a clash between Christianity and Islam. Hello, and furthermore hello to all my moto mammies and my moto papis, and welcome back to the Hispanophiles podcast, Travel in Spain with only half a brain. This is the only podcast where Mercadona does not mean you're desperate to have a kebab. My name is James Buffery, and on today's episode we are giving to you another idiot city guide. This time we are travelling to a city of faith, frontiers and fortresses. It's the former capital right in the middle of Castilla, Toledo, a city I visited recently and have amazing memories of. However, we do need to start with our regular podcast segment. So today we are beginning with the Spanish vocab of the week. Something I've learned recently. I can't remember if I read this or if in a conversation with somebody I realised this was a gap in my knowledge, but the vocab this week is ceguera deliberada. 2 words. Ceguera being blindness. Deliberada, in this case, willful. So, ceguera deliberada, willful blindness. Again, not entirely sure where I came over this, but willful blindness being an occasion when somebody does not want to admit the truth that is right in front of them for whatever motivation. Could be personal, religious, political. Your guess is as good as mine, but that's what it means. Ceguera deliberada, willful blindness. Moving on to the Spanish news of the week. And this one is huge. This is mega. For the first time since 2018, an Iberian lynx has been spotted in Catalonia, in the Pre-Pyrenees in Lleida province, I think quite close to the city, but I couldn't find an exact location. One of those wildlife camera traps set out in somewhere in the wilderness spotted a 4-year-old male. It was one that had been tagged. It was wearing a transmitting collar around its neck, and Secreto, the name given to this particular lynx, was spotted in March 2025, and this was made public by the Generalitat de Catalunya on, I think, the 23rd of May 25, so a couple months later. The male in particular, Secreto, was tagged in Andalusia in 2022, meaning Secreto travelled hundreds of miles away from when he was last seen or interacted with by humans. The Iberian lynx disappeared from Catalonia altogether around the 1950s, we think. I couldn't find a definitive year when that happened while doing the research. This of particular interest to us on this podcast because I think it was episode 10 with the viewer and fan favourite Angelique. We did an episode dedicated to the wildlife that is most dangerous to you here in Spain. The lynx, not something that is going to hunt you, but it will be aggressive and territorial if it feels it is threatened. We discovered in that episode that the thing was on the edge of extinction. About year 2000, it was estimated that only 100 remained in the wild. So now we're at a stage where there are believed to be 2,000 of them living wild across the Iberian Peninsula, a consequence of an extraordinarily successful preservation effort on behalf of the Spanish state. The reason why the Iberian lynx came so close to extinction was a consequence of loss of habitat, but more specifically, 2 separate disease pandemics wiped out a lot of its preferred prey, being the wild rabbit, an animal that is native to the Iberian Peninsula, and that took a heavy toll on the lynx population. So to have approximately 2,000 now roaming the countryside is very, very good news and something we should be thrilled about. That's enough for the regular segments. Let's move in now to our main talking point of this episode and the reason I am sure you have clicked. The city guide to Toledo. The way I'm going to do this is I will take you on a figurative walking tour around the city, pointing out sites, explaining their historic relevance, explaining their history and their cultural relevance today. And that will allow you to get an insight into the story of Toledo through the ages and what may be the sites most worth visiting, in my humble opinion. First and foremost, 3 books proved invaluable in the preparation for this podcast episode. One is Maria Rosa Menocal's Ornament of the World, How Muslims, Jews and Christians Created a Culture of Tolerance in Medieval Spain, published by Back Bay Books. The second, James A. Michener's Iberia, published by the Dial Press. And third and foremost, Giles Tremlett's España, A Brief History of Spain, published by Head of Zeus. Are you ready? You've got a good pair of walking shoes, a bottle of water, your camera, good, I can see you're ready, let's start right now. The basic facts, Toledo, what you need to know, it is the administrative capital of Castilla-La Mancha, one of the larger regions of Spain. It has a population of 86,000 as of 2024. I believe it is the second most populous city in Castilla-La Mancha, after Guadalajara, I think, took the biscuit. And it is located 40 kilometers southwest of Madrid. So where do we start? First and foremost, Toledo train station. I'm going to be bold and say it is one of the prettiest train stations I've ever seen in Spain. Located east of the city centre, it only has connections to Madrid. So if you're going to plan a trip, don't expect you can get a train from Valencia, Malaga, Granada, Sevilla in the south, or Barcelona from the east. You've got to go to Madrid first and then get the train down, costing you 14 euros one way. So it is quite an expensive thing to go one way, so just bear that in mind. But of course, if you're going by road, it is easy to drive from all directions and not particularly difficult to get to, even in spite of adverse weather. But the train station opened on the 24th of April 1919. We have some white walls with sandstone small bricks creating Moorish archways that you can see immediately inside if you look up, with windows and stained glass that have a geometric design lining all around them. We've got a dark coffered wooden ceiling above. I'm not an expert on different wood types, different trees, but my assumption would be that it is ebony, given how dark it looks. But you can just about see those golden accents around the geometric designs, giving it a real feel of luxury, even though it's just a humble train station. And then in the main hall, off the western side, we have the main ticket office. And I think on the eastern side, we have a small cafe serving tapas, ice creams, chips, beer, drink, whatever it may be. But then in the main hall, we've got this wooden block that I guess houses a couple of either storage rooms or offices. You cannot miss this thing. The tiles on the bottom third of it are beautiful. We have framed photos of the train station in black and white when it was opened at the beginning of the 20th century. Built in clock face, just off-white. I never figured out what this block contains, but like I said, it must have some functions for people working inside the train station. That can be my only guess. Chandeliers from the ceiling in the main hall that are ornate but not overbearing, give a real wonderful warm glow inside it. We step outside the train station, we can see another clear attempt to replicate Moorish design in the architecture, all sandstone brick, so a complete common colour to everything. There's nothing that clashes, particularly with regards to colour. And a large clock tower built into the eastern side of the station. Take a few steps back and you can admire it fully. But we're not here to visit just a train station. Let's carry on. We're going to start walking westward from the train station. We've got a couple of roads in front of us. We go up a slight hill, passing some trees, past a few humble places of business, around a small bend, and we are at this stage immediately confronted by what is the defining geographical feature of Toledo, being El Río Tajo, the Tagus River, as it is known in English, the longest in Spain, 1,007 kilometers in length. It's a big old boy. The source is somewhere in the hills between Cuenca in Castilla-La Mancha and Teruel in Aragon, and the mouth finds the sea at, can you guess? Correct, Lisbon in Portugal. At this point where we are, you stand overlooking the riverbank into the dark, very fast-moving water below. You can see the city opposite on a giant headland of big, strong rock. And the river, the Tagus River, curls around this headlands. It has dug itself into the more porous rock and surrounds the city centre to the east, to the south, and to the west, giving the city a natural defence, a natural barrier on three sides. Why would you build the city here? The answer, clearly, defence. A deep, fast river on all three sides means that it'll be more difficult for invading armies to get into your city centre. Furthermore, north of Toledo, there is another natural geological defence that will prevent any intruders entering. North of the town, there is no river, but the altitude of the headland means that it serves as a natural defence against potential intruders wanting to take the city from the north. You turn off the road at this stage. We're going to leave that road behind us. We're going to approach the Puente de Alcantara, the Alcantara Bridge. Alcantara, apparently an Arabic word literally meaning the arch. This is a pedestrian bridge. It is the most celebrated bridge of Toledo. On the western side, we have the gate into the city, which is called the Puerta de Alcantara, notably medieval in its aesthetic. It's got a very clear defensive structure to it. It's got turrets on top and small windows for archers to help defend the city in medieval times. Be careful with your step here. The stones set into the floor beneath you can be very slippery when wet, which they were when I was there, with right-angled corners going up as you walk through the gates and up to the city. Again, designed in medieval times to make it very difficult for infantry, for troops, and people on horseback to enter the city quickly. Looking back now across the road, the Puente de Alcantara was designated a National Cultural Monument in 1921, and it is this site that gives us a great segue to explore the first civilization that shaped the history of Toledo. That civilization, of course, being the Romans. The Puente de Alcantara was built by Romans who established a colony in this part of the world in 192 BC. They, of course, gave it its name originally, Toledo, and it's not difficult to see how that would over time migrate to become Toledo as we know it today. In truth, the Romans were far more interested in the Mediterranean side of the Iberian Peninsula. First and foremost, they wanted to extract the minerals and resources for their own trading purposes, meaning that rather than kind of building roads, bridges overland, they tried to build them toward the sea so that this wealth could be extracted. Regional trade, again, for the vast majority of European history, the Mediterranean, North Africa advanced saw far greater levels of human sophistication compared to Northern Europe. The people that the Romans wanted to trade with were not based on the Atlantic coast, in the Celtic world, in Scandinavia. They were all around the Mediterranean. And the third thing, opportunities for agricultural colonies, similar to what the Phoenicians did when they settled in places like Cadiz and Marseille. The far more, let's say, generous climates of the Mediterranean parts of Spain were conducive to the Romans growing barley, grapes, olives, lemons for consumption. Therefore, the Romans didn't look at the Pyrenees, the Basque region, much of upland central Spain that favourably. It was not of interest. So why did they create a town in Toledo? It was a military garrison. The peoples, the native peoples of the Iberian Peninsula at the time, the Celtiberians, and again, that is a word that we can use to describe many different tribes, many different polities, many different peoples who didn't necessarily leave good records of their own existence. The Celtiberians were unruly, untrustworthy. They were a nuisance to the Romans, who saw themselves as militarily and economically superior. Thus, a garrison that was naturally protected by a river was a clear asset in Roman attempts to bring the Iberian Peninsula and its native peoples under their control. Post the Second Punic War, which is the one involving Hannibal and his elephants, Rome did not really see how any of the ragtag tribes spread across the Iberian Peninsula could pose a serious challenge to their rule. But eventually, when Rome itself fell to Germanic barbarians, their rule over the Iberian Peninsula fractured, much as it did in Gaul, as it did in Britain, in many other faraway provinces of Rome. The problems they had on the doorstep were far greater than those that were currently threatening their interests in Hispania, in the Iberian Peninsula. And eventually, a new barbarian power arrived to take their place as the dominant polity. We will get to who they are. We've climbed that massive hill from the Puerta de Alcantara. Good job. We've walked over slippy stones up the hill, passing a few sites that we will return to. The Convento de la Concepción Francisca, the Museo Santa Cruz, which we'll visit before we finish this tour, and the famous Alcázar, one of the dominant features of Toledo that you will see in a landscape photo or from a distance. And the final thing we'll see at this stage is a statue of Miguel de Cervantes, Spain's greatest literary figure of history, as we walk through the Arco de la Sangre into what is the centre of action of contemporary Toledo. So let's take a quick breather. Let's just take a moment to review our surroundings. What do we see? A triangular shaped square. In the middle, we've got a couple of kiosks selling flowers, selling soft drinks, one of them selling newspapers and magazines. We've got a kiosk for tourist information. In fact, a couple of tourist groups are gathering right now to do their guided city tours. If we look a bit further, we can see a couple of the usual American fast food chains and some of the cafe chains that are native to Spain. This is the Plaza de Socorro, the main square where people meet before a night out, people meet for dates, the first point of stop for many people on their tourist visit to the city. Like I said, triangular in shape, which makes it a little bit of an odd plaza compared to many other you will see in many other cities. All main walking routes through the city kind of begin and end here. But there's not too much, I think, of interest here compared to what we'll be visiting elsewhere in the city. Let's start walking. To the north, we have Calle Armas. This loops around the north side of the city, and we will come back to that way later on our tour. This street, Calle Armas, if you walk from the north to the south, becomes Carretera de Carlos V, the highway of Charles V. Not a carretera, not a highway in any sense of the word, it's only 2 lanes and with very slow moving traffic due to the abundance of pedestrians around. This road leads to the Alcázar, again, we'll come back later on to that, but going west from the Plaza de Socorro is Calle Comercio, the commercial street, the main shopping area of Toledo. This leads into the Old Town, a web of angular narrow streets leading from this particular square, very typical of medieval Spain, the way in which their towns and cities were constructed. Nothing is parallel, there are no right angles, just a web of strange lines with buildings packed very closely into each other without any clear central planning whatsoever. It's most likely that your accommodation is around here. This is a place of lots of Airbnbs, hotels, so you're going to be familiarising yourself with this area probably quite a lot. It isn't so noisy around here, and at this point I will say Toledo is quite a safe city, so you're probably going to be fine walking back this area at night by yourself. We keep walking, we're going westward, and we get to Calle Alfileritos. This is Toledo's go-out spot. It's Bar Street. Very different from Seal Street in Liverpool, Broad Street in Birmingham, the avenues in Hull. Nothing like those. It's a narrow pedestrian street, very little in the way of advertising. It's kept quite dark and quite quiet at night. No kebab shops whatsoever. It's quite classy, quite elegant, and honestly, you would walk past this place without realising what it is, what goes on behind the doors of some of the bars here. Some of the better ones, Botanic Bar Legendario. This was the one recommended to me for the quality of its drinks and, in particular, of its cocktails. Livingston, a little tavern I walked into and realised in a few seconds I was the oldest person in the entire establishment. My preference was Cervecería La Abadía. Excellent. I was there 2 consecutive nights. Bright inside, very white, charming staff, a good selection of beers that I think were locally brewed, though I'm not entirely sure, but also some excellent wine and food served. Love the place. That would be my suggestion if you're looking for a place to eat and drink in the city. There's a bunch of cheap accommodation also around Calle Alfileritos as well, if you're looking for kind of studenty, Erasmus-y, hostel type. That's where you're going to find that. But we don't have time. We're still walking. We will proceed to our next stop, dodging the tourists and waiters along Calle Plata, and we're going to pass Plaza de San Vicente to get to Plaza San Román and its eponymous church right in front of it. Good news. This is the highest hill, the highest point in all of Toledo. So it's all downhill walking from here. We've done quite a lot of marching quite quickly, but now we've got a bit of time for a break, a bit of respite. We're going to go in the church, San Román Church. It's built to the back of the Campus de Toledo, the north side, the university facilities in the city. Let's take a quick look round. We see more high walls with strong, rough, golden biscuit-coloured walls all around us, very lacking in detail, in anything ornate, in anything designed to be aesthetically pleasing. These are functional, strong, tall, resistant walls. We see the telltale thin flat bricks of the Mudéjar architectural style, which we'll be exploring very, very shortly. Narrow pedestrian walkways. It's austere. There's zero external decoration, apart from the big wooden doors, which contain treasures within. So the Iglesia de San Román, named as such after the Christian conquest of Toledo in 1085. It's not the actual church, neither its use in an ecclesiastical sense, which interests us here. It is what it has become, which is the Museo de los Concilios y la Cultura Visigotha, the Museum of Visigothic Councils and Culture. After the Romans, it was the Visigoths who next left their stamp on the city of Toledo. Free of charge to enter this museum. They will take your name and a couple of stats, your country of origin, where you've come from. That's just for their internal research purposes. You walk inside, and it is dark. Above, you see immediately curved arches and long columns of the Umayyad dynasty. The red and white voussoirs, I believe I've pronounced that correctly, the little sections that you see inside those archways are immediately reminiscent of La Mezquita de Córdoba. Texts of different scripts line the walls all around you, but most of it is a combination of Arabic and, to a lesser degree, Hebrew in this particular place, mostly Arabic. The Christians who came after in the late 11th and then 12th centuries chose not to desecrate, not to remove this text from the walls. And nowadays we must be thankful that they resisted, because it gives so much beauty, so much depth to what you're seeing in front of you. Samarkand was never a mosque. Bear that in mind. This was not something built by the Umayyads, by the Muslims at any stage. It was a Visigothic Christian place of worship from the very beginning, but never a mosque. The decorative style you see all around you it tells the story of how the 12th century Christians responded to the glamour of Moorish design, Moorish art, Moorish culture that they inherited. Thankfully, there are an array of Visigothic remains and statues inside this museum, one of the best collections of Visigothic artifacts anywhere in Spain. Who were the Visigoths? What does that mean? Translating literally, it means noble Goth. They were a Germanic tribe that became the ruling elite in the Iberian Peninsula in the 5th century as the Western Roman Empire collapsed. They didn't take over straight away. A bunch of different tribes who were also Germanic in nature, the Alans, the Suebi, the Vandals, they came into the power vacuum left by the Romans, but the Visigoths followed and took the territory by storm. According to James Michener in the book Iberia we mentioned at the beginning, the Visigoths took the city in 453 AD. From the early days, the Visigoths were practicing Christians, but it was in 589 AD. King Recared I was the one to decide that Catholicism should be the religion across his empire in the Iberian Peninsula. This is a large factor why Catholicism became the primary religion of later Spain. And in Visigothic Spain, of course, Toledo was the seat of military power, due again to the fact it was endowed with natural defences against potential invading armies. But it was also a religious centre. Its councils and bishops wrote policy for the rest of their territory concerning religious matters and practice that were then executed throughout Visigothic Hispania. Its neighbours, its rivals, slowly fell. The kingdom of the Suebi in northeast Iberia fell in 585, and then the Eastern Roman imperial presence, the Byzantines, in what is now more or less Catalonia and Valencia, ended in 624 under the rule of King Suintila. Thus, in the 7th century, the Visigothic kingdom was the absolute major power on the Iberian Peninsula, and therefore its capital, Toledo, is more or less seen by many as the first genuine capital of what later became Spain. What was life like in the Visigothic kingdom? Most of you will know, no doubt, that the Christians post-Reconquest, the Muslims and the Romans, and to a lesser degree the Phoenicians and Greeks that came before, endowed us with a far greater degree of cultural artifacts, of writing, of art, of sculptures than the Visigothic kings. These people were not so interested in cultural output and in the arts, more inclined toward administration, trade and military capabilities. We do have some carvings, some statues that have survived. Many of them are in Samarkand, but the artistry, the level of detail never impresses as much. These people were not so inclined to invest their resources in creating beautiful things to decorate their roads and their houses. And then eventually they declined, almost overnight. And we have two fascinating legends that attempt to explain what happened to the Visigoths. One legend, King Roderick, ruling from Toledo, apparently developed an interest in the young daughter of Count Julian of Ceuta, one of his friends and advisors. His daughter, Florinda, apparently King Roderick would take to spying on her bathing in the bushes by the river. One day he let his lust and urges get the better of him, and he jumped out while she was bathing naked, violated her. Of course, news got round very quickly. Count Julian fled across the Strait of Gibraltar to Ceuta, gathered a Moorish army, led them across the strait and to Toledo, sacked the city, killed Roderick, and that was the end of Visigothic rule. Another legend, upon entry into the city, King Roderick approached a door of an ancient tower that had 27 padlocks placed over the top. It was said that every Visigothic king, by tradition, added a padlock to this door to prevent the escape of a terrible secret inside. But over time, people had forgotten what that secret was. Roderick, believing that he was immune to whatever terrible secret, whatever curse lay inside, hacked away at the locks, opened the door up, and found a scroll. He opened it up and read the following words: "Whenever this chamber is violated, and the spell contained in this urn is broken, the people painted on these walls will invade Spain, overthrow its kings, and subdue the entire land." All around the walls of that forbidden tower were Berbers, Arabs, Moors on horseback holding scimitars. Now, of course, these are just legends. These are not actual events, we believe. We do not know what secret tower this was, neither who built it or who decided to endow it with this terrible curse. What is definitely true, however, is that in 711, the Muslims from northern Africa, led by General Tariq, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and embarked on an epic crusade across Spain in incredibly quick fashion. One small thing, General Tariq. Jabal Tariq is the Arabic for Tariq's mountain, and Jabal Tariq over time became Gibraltar. So when you see the rock, don't forget it's named after a Moorish general. How long did it take the Moors to get to Toledo? 1 year. In 712, 3 years after his accession to the throne, King Roderick was displaced and the Moorish rule of Toledo began. Before we can contemplate life in Umayyad Spain, in Muslim Spain, in the 8th century, we need to move from San Roman further west and explore another part of this city. And the place we're going to be exploring next is a fantastic window into the history, into the culture of a group who are tragically often forgotten in Spanish history. We walk south from San Roman, down those narrow, sloping walkways between these strong, tall walls around the campus of Toledo. We're going to pass the Museo de la Inquisición, the Inquisition Museum, which I sadly did not get to visit. This spot where we are right now is considered the center of historic Toledo, and this is where the Juderia begins. This is Toledo's Jewish quarter, arguably the most celebrated part of the city, and for me, by a country mile, the coolest part of it. The Juderia is more or less a collection of tightly packed streets in more or less a labyrinth, quite frankly, with lots of residential housing made of typically thin uniform bricks around a series of small plazas and a few main streets that act as a couple main arteries through the part of town. As you walk, as you explore, as you get your camera out and snap away, throughout the Juderia you will see small blue tiles pressed into the floor. Some of them have Hebrew text on them, some of them are an explicit demarcation of where you are, of being in the Juderia, and some of them contain the menorah, the candlestick that is a fundamental part of Jewish religious practice. The Iglesia del Salvador stands at the foot of Calle de Santo Tomé, the main thoroughfare in the Juderia. This is the former home of the artisans, the craftsmen, the merchants, the middle-class business owners. Again, the Toledo's Jews were crucial in these roles, and Santo Tomé is synonymous with this era of Toledo's history. There are two key products that are sold in abundance in Toledo that are a little bit unusual. One is marzipan, and one is steel weaponry. And we're going to come back to these points after we visit a few excellent places inside the Juderia. We go left. We go past the Iglesia de Santo Tomé, named after the street, of course, with its former minaret now converted into a bell tower, easily recognisable mudéjar design, and a clear point on the skyline in this part of the city. Up the street, directly to our right, there is a tiny craft beer bar called Lupolo, which is the Spanish word for hops. Went in there a couple of times, good local beers, small but quite quaint, and a good atmosphere. Really enjoyed it, would highly recommend it. We're not going to go further along Calle Santo Tomé. We're going to turn left the other way, down a small alleyway, and continue southwest. We're going to arrive at Calle de los Reyes Católicos, the main road on the western side of the city, one where driving is allowed. There is traffic here, but it is also largely pedestrianised. Judaism in Spain, the life of Jews inside Toledo in the medieval era. Sevilla, Córdoba, Lucerna, and Toledo were key centres of Jewish culture in the Middle Ages. The earliest evidence we have of Jews in Spain goes back to the 1st century BC, which is, of course, the Roman era of Spain, and the clearest archaeological evidence we have of Jewish settlements in the land dates from the 3rd to the 5th century AD. The Visigoths, our new friends, were not particularly kind to the Jews. They put the Jews in the lowest social category inside their kingdom, but they did understand the commercial value of their trades and of their professions. With church backing, the Visigothic state did limit freedoms of Jews under their rule, but in practice, many anti-Semitic pieces of legislation that were written by the Visigothic church in Toledo were not really that well enforced in those places, Sevilla, Córdoba, that we mentioned. So the life of a Jew under the Visigoths, not particularly pleasant. Then, all of a sudden, we get the Moorish rule, which we'll explore very, very soon, and the life of a Jew in Spain improved dramatically. Under the Umayyads, they were given self-governance with representation of Jewish interests in the Islamic courts. They weren't granted to own land, but they could rent land for commercial enterprises, paying taxes, of course. And many were artisans, many were merchants, many were business owners. There was no limit to the educational ambitions of Jews inside Islamic Spain. Then we have the Almohads and the Almoravids, the following polities after the Umayyads. They were more fundamentalist in their interpretation of the Quran, and they were not tolerant of Jews and Christians living inside their domain as the Umayyads were. This led to a widespread exodus of Christians and Jews from the most southern parts of Spain, and after Toledo had been captured in 1085 by Alfonso VI, we'll speak about him shortly, Christian Toledo became a haven for Jewish interests. Thus, as the Almohads and the Almoravids ruled over what we now call Andalusia, Jews engaged in an exodus to Toledo. This further endowed the city with its incredible depth of culture in the late 11th century and early 12th century. And the Juderia stands alone inside Spain as a place of tolerance of the Jewish tradition and therefore as a place of Jewish art and literature. Then we fast forward to the Catholic conquest of Nasrid Granada, the final explicit Muslim polity inside the Iberian Peninsula. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabel, their government issued a decree to expel Jews immediately from Spain on the 31st of March 1492, with pain of death if they did not convert or leave the country. The Jews that were dismissed in this period to this day are known as the Sephardic Jews. Their exodus was to much of North Africa and the Levant, and to this day there are some communities of Jews that speak a Hebrew similar to the Sephardic Jews in the 15th and 16th centuries that had to migrate away from Spain under pain of death. So, let's visit a couple of key sites in the Juderia de Toledo to understand a little bit more about the life of Jews in medieval Spain and how that affects Toledo to this day. We got to the Calle de los Reyes Católicos, the main street on the western side of the city. We're going to walk slightly, and on our right we see a small doorway in a wall of bare brick once again, 5 steps leading up to this doorway. A little here to indicate that this is a place of intrigue, of our interest. But I tell you, it is completely worthy of your attention. There is a small white plaque on the wall saying Santa María la Blanca, Monumento Nacional, with a description below of this as a former synagogue. Watch your step, we go through the doorway and enter a courtyard within bare earth. Beneath us, to the left-hand side, we've got some tiles, some pavings, some concrete slabs laid down, and beyond there we've got the visitor centre where you can buy your tickets to enter Santa María la Blanca and get your souvenirs as well. That is where I bought the book, The Ornament of the World, the one I mentioned at the beginning, which is one of the ones used to create this script for this podcast episode, so I feel grateful it's there. Around the courtyard, we've got some fragrant trees and a canopy offering some much-needed shade in this part of the world. All around the courtyard, there are walls of rough brick with dark stone put inside them, and in front of us, a building. It's deliberately not particularly extravagant or ostentatious in its appearance when seen from the outside. A couple of wooden double doors in the front allow us to enter. One thing I will say, when I was there, it was quite a busy day in terms of visitors, and there was one young man, probably about 8 years old, dressed head to foot in the garb of a medieval crusader, complete with plastic swords, something I found a little bit amusing in a place dedicated to Judaism. The Crusaders, of course, not being particularly, let's say, accommodating of the interests of Jews and Muslims. We walk inside, and we see immediately 24 octagonal columns across the main room, with capitals on each one, under again, typical Moorish arches. These octagonal columns are plastered white. We have small brown tiles across the floor beneath our feet. The capitals on top of the arches are surprisingly low, about 9 foot from the ground, I would say. I could not find an online source to confirm that. But those capitals, sandstone coloured with elaborate designs, that kind of made me think of perforated octopus tentacles that are kind of reaching upwards from the abyss, from the depths. Above those Moorish archways, made of white plaster with golden accents, and in the main aisle in the middle of the synagogue we see plastered walls above the columns with repeating intricate geometric relief. Very beautiful. Not a single image of a human, of any kind of deity. Again, this being something that is far more Christian and therefore not something we're going to find in synagogues of medieval Spain. It's all geometric design. The plaster then above the archways has yet more columns with curling Moorish archways above, with white plaster and a dark brown wooden roof. But then at the front we have a clear Christian altar inside a synagogue right at the top of the building, resplendent in gold, far more ostentatious, deliberately trying to be impressive but also a little bit flexy, a bit flaunty compared to the austerity and subtle charm of the rest of the synagogue. We've got angelic statues, we've got a couple of painted icons there as well, and it creates a very strong visual contrast from the rest of the building. Santa Maria la Blanca, the synagogue, its most fabled story comes from 1405. At this time, a Dominican speaker from Valencia, San Vicente Ferrer, he was known for his passionate speeches and apparently his ability to convert Jews on the spot, show them the error of their ways, and in a flash, with nothing more than a few words, convert them into Christians. In the late 14th century, early 15th century, the Jews in Spain were blamed for inducing the Black Death, the plague, the bubonic plague in the 1340s that apparently wiped out half of Spain's population, up to 70% in cities such as Seville. There were a series of anti-Jewish riots in Castile and Aragon in the 1390s. The death toll was estimated at 100,000. So this man Ferrer visited Toledo to give sermons to the congregations in 1405. After one of his speeches, one of his lectures, the congregation of said church were left so impassioned by what he'd said that they took it upon themselves to arm themselves, to grab weapons, and they broke into the Santa Maria la Blanca synagogue, grabbed any Jews who had the misfortune of being inside at the time, dragged them by their hair, by their clothes, by their arms out. They brought them to the cliff overlooking the Tagus River, slit their throats, and threw bodies into the water below. In their absence, the synagogue was converted into a church. Now, of the three Abrahamic monotheistic religions, Judaism is the one whose doctrine I am least familiar with, but my understanding is that after a synagogue is used for worship of any other religion, the Jews can no longer use it as a place of worship. And therefore, another synagogue was needed for the Jewish population in Toledo as a consequence of that fateful day. Santa Maria la Blanca, I absolutely recommend visiting. €4 entry, so not a big expense whatsoever. It is open most days. I believe closed for the Jewish Sabbath, which of course is Saturdays. I don't entirely recall, and I couldn't find a confirmation on online source of that, but I believe that is the case. Let's go to our next place of interest. We're going to walk down the road from Santa Maria la Blanca, Calle de los Reyes Católicos, about 200 meters, so this is very close by. The Juderia opens up at this point, with the park on the right-hand side. The narrow streets disappear. It's a much wide open space. We've got a cafe there. We've got a couple of public toilets. We've got a mirador, a place for good views, overlooking the Tagus River here. This is El Paseo del Tránsito. The name indicates the next place of interest where we're going to stop now. Behind you on the corner is El Tránsito. Way different immediately. It is tall, it is proud, it is not shying away behind the walls like Santa Maria la Blanca. An elegant tiled roof and arched window frames again give an indication as to the era and function of this building. So we're going to walk up to the heavy doors and enter El Tránsito, my favourite place in the entire city. The real name was the Synagogue of Samuel Halevi, built sometime in the mid-14th century. Samuel Halevi himself, he was born in 1320, died in 1360, so only 40 years old. He was a treasurer of the court of King Pedro I of Castile and was also a diplomat and court judge. So immediately we see here the way in which medieval Spaniards, the Catholics, would employ people of the Jewish faith before Jews were expelled from Spain. El Tránsito, the conventional name for the synagogue, was donated by the monarchy to the Order of Calatrava and quickly converted to a church yet again and burial place for prominent military figures in 16th century Spain. Unfortunately, there's been very poor record keeping of El Tránsito. Thus, there are big gaps in our knowledge of how it's been used in later centuries. Modern technology, the use of lasers and such, has revealed a lot in the previous decades about the hidden complexities inside the building. But let's explore for ourselves. Get your cameras ready. This is going to be worth it. There is one main room, one room that dominates the building. This is the Great Prayer Hall. It is aesthetically the most impressive part of El Tránsito. Completely unlike Santa Maria la Blanca. No columns whatsoever. The room is narrow and it is tall and it is relatively empty. for lack of a better word. It's barely 10 metres in width, with plain dark rectangular floor tiles and white plaster on the walls. There is a first floor gallery overlooking the hall. The top quarter of the walls of the Great Prayer Hall, we see here more exquisitely detailed carvings. No paint, no colour, but it does not need it. It is endowed with Moorish archways yet again, with windows that look like stained glass, but not containing a biblical story of this saint or that saint or whatever. We have geometric designs inside those stained glass windows, something very unique I've not really seen many places before. Above the ceiling, the roof, we have a powerful mahogany roof, but with a far more innate coffered ceiling, with support beams and geometrical stars with golden accents looking above. But the best part in the Great Prayer Hall of El Tránsito is the main wall. We have here one of the most incredible relief designs I have ever seen in all my journeys in Spain. There are three main sections, one left and one right. They both match, one in the middle being the widest, the largest, the most impressive, but all three have common elements. The main one, this isn't a geometric design pattern that you'll see in much of Andalusia. The motifs that I see, for me, far more reminiscent of plants or flowers. In the background, we can see green and red colours. Again, something we didn't see in Santa Maria la Blanca, but these are muted, not vivid whatsoever. And this adds a subtlety and a look of genuine taste and class, which I like a lot about El Tránsito. We have Hebrew text carved directly into the plaster that line the borders of the central section of the three we discussed. The Moorish archways above overlook these three sections with two more Moorish stained glass windows that we just saw on the longer wall. Above that, we have more Hebrew text carved directly into the plaster, into the wall, but this does have gold highlights on a dark grey-green background. Right at the bottom of this wall, we see a cavity with a wonderfully exquisite golden fabric curtain right at the back and a big box draped in dark fabric with golden stars on top of this box with embroidered Hebrew text. I believe this contains a Torah. This room is my favourite part of Toledo. I think the powerful, sincere aesthetic of the main wall and the design here, I've not seen many things like this in Spain. It's not threatening, it's not overbearing, and it's so distinct from what I've seen elsewhere in Spain. Where does the name El Tránsito come from? In the 16th century, the entrance arch and arcosoleum, which is a wall tomb, were added by the Order of Calatrava, and they also commissioned El Tránsito de la Virgen, the Death of the Virgin painting. That is now located in El Prado, but it was this painting that gave the synagogue of Samuel Halevi its nickname we use today. In 1873, the Spanish state assumed possession of the Samuel Halevi Synagogue, and it was added to its Monuments Commission. 1877, it was declared a national monument. Slowly, some of the more Christian elements were removed, again, at a time when Spain was unapologetically Catholic, first and foremost, and with not a particularly great appetite for accommodating other religions, let's put it that way. Nevertheless, many Christian elements that had been later added to the synagogue were deliberately removed in an attempt to honour its Jewish past. In 1964, the synagogue became the Museo Sephardi, the Sephardic Museum, open to the public finally after many restorative works in 1971. And if you proceed off the rooms from the Great Prayer Hall and you go into the first floor gallery, this museum shows you a very detailed history of Judaism in Spain and Iberia, and also a good first introduction, I think, to many main components of Jewish culture and religious practice. The importance of the Juderia of Toledo, and specifically of El Tránsito and Santa Maria la Blanca, is that it adds a clear contrast to what later became the dominant narrative of Spanish history, which was a clash between Christianity and Islam. For many years, that more or less that was seen to be the correct way of viewing medieval Spanish history prior to Catholic conquest in 1492. The Jews in Spain, in medieval Spain, are often overlooked, their contributions watered down, their works ignored, but they did have a huge role in trade, in commerce, in education, in art, and this is clear when you visit El Tránsito and El Museo Sephardi. The records, the photos, the artifacts on display in this museum do a great job of honouring that part of Spanish history and of Jewish history as well. That is El Tránsito. We're now going to walk out and we're going to go to what is one of the oddest museums in Spain I've ever visited with regards to layouts. That is the El Greco Museum. El Greco, who was he? Born in Heraklion, Domenico Theotokopoulos, I think I've got that right, died in 1614. He occupies a huge space in the history of Spanish art. Educated in Venice originally, he specialised in oil painting and was noted for his use of colour and interest in human anatomy, which was quite common in the early Renaissance. His brushwork, his ability to capture intense emotions for expression rather than dramatic action, is something that nowadays defines his later work as an artist. Many of his works were portraits, but again, not of some impressive noble duke or king, standing in a strong, regal pose. No, it tends to be people looking forlorn, looking distracted, looking pensive in, if anything, unflattering backgrounds, if that makes sense. Therefore, his portraits focus more on capturing a character profile rather than trying to beautify or flatter a subject inside the painting. The Greco works I saw inside this museum are softer. They don't have a huge amount of vibrancy in the colour. How did El Greco arrive in Toledo? He arrived in 1577 and was commissioned to work on the altarpiece of the church Santo Domingo Antiguo, but his early career did not pan out particularly well. He struggled to cope with the religious and cultural orthodoxy of 16th century Spain. Nevertheless, he was able to fund his career by producing portraits of private patrons, and he generally loved life in Toledo. He felt at home, which is why the city has embraced him so much. The compound of this museum, it was designed by Marquis de la Vega Inclán in the 20th century. This man thought he was buying El Greco's former home, but now we know that to not be the case, which I do find quite amusing. Nevertheless, the museum itself, this compound, it essentially comes to an elegant aristocratic house with 2 floors and a garden, a 2-tiered garden all around it. And you walk through the garden, up the steps, past statues, past fountains, to the front door, and it is beautiful. The statues are classical, which would be totally fitting for a Greek painter. The first floor, it gives a bit of an exposition into 16th century Toledo life, with many of the rooms left how they would have been at the time. The southwest wing has the chapel and exhibition, but the main jewels are on the top floor. We come out onto the second floor, then the southwest wing on the top floor. We have the famous apostolic painting collection, 12 of them, plus Jesus Christ himself. The El Greco Museum also contains a painting of Toledo from the surrounding hills, Vista y Plan de Toledo, painted from 1610 to 1614, unusual in Spain at the time, but very impressive to look at this day. So these are the 3 main sites I wanted to show you around the Juderia. I think it's time we start walking again. Let's go back to Calle Santo Tomé quickly. I mentioned 2 products that were sold in unusual abundance here in Toledo that many of the tourists come to buy: marzipan and steel. Let's quickly take a second to just explore these. Toledo has always been famous for the quality of its steel, for the artisan work that goes into making swords, knives, axes, shields, weaponry. Toledo is where you come to get your sword. Obviously, our governments nowadays give our soldiers assault rifles and not swords. Therefore, the people of Toledo making steel weapons tend to make swords for bullfighters, for fencing, for ceremony, for King Charles III, whoever it may be. It's one of those inexplicable things. Maybe it's purely as a consequence of the fact that it was a military garrison right at the beginning and it sat at the centre of many wars, many disputes. It was a place to get your swords. The other speciality, marzipan. In Spanish, mazapan. It is made using the oil of seeds of almonds taken from the coastal Mediterranean region. You dip almonds in boiling water, remove the tough skin, and then add this 1 part almond, 1 part cane sugar into the mix, 50 minutes in an oven, glaze the outcome with sugar water, and then rest for 10 minutes, and then your marzipan should be ready. Almonds, an interesting thing, not native to the Iberian Peninsula, introduced by the next polity we're going to be discussing, the Moors. But sugar is a commodity that clearly came from colonial Americas, and the primary commodity that came to the European markets as a consequence of the transatlantic slave trade that Spain clearly played a major part in. So let's continue walking. We're going to go back to the Calle de los Reyes Católicos. We're going northward this time. We're going to pass the Toledo Art School and the Monasterio de San Juan de los Reyes on the left-hand side of us. These two buildings are grand, overbearing, deliberately impressive in their size, in their scale, therefore not in keeping with the rest of the Juderia, even though they are inside the Jewish quarter. I would guess this is probably by design. Again, the Catholics were not welcoming of the Jews in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. The road begins to snake, and it leads us down a hill, past another couple of cafes, restaurants, artisan shops selling souvenirs. We get to the northern edge of Toledo city centre, and this is where the hill, the natural defence of city centre to the north, starts to make its way down. In front of us, the Puerta del Cambrón, one of the gates that forms a defensive line to the north of the city. We'll go eastward. We have now left Toledo's Juderia. The roads still narrow, big strong walls either side of us. Very little natural light, it's dark, it's musty, there's an echo of your own footsteps, but apart from that, no other noise around you. The main tourist information office is located on this part of town, but as we walk eastward along these protective walls, all of a sudden there is a clearing and we get an excellent view of modern Toledo to the north, half the city outside of the traditional city centre. Two things we can see very clearly here at this point. One is the Estadio Salto del Caballo, the football stadium of the local team, Club Deportivo Toledo, and we also have the very, very large Toledo Hospital. But we're not going to go there, we still have much to see inside the city centre itself. We're going to continue eastward for 500 metres. Careful dodging cars in these narrow streets, don't get yourself run over by accident. And we get to the Puerta del Sol, in the middle of the northern flank. This is another one of the gates, with also a fantastic view of the new town to the north, and it is just in front of the next stop on our tour, the one that allows us to understand Islamic Toledo and Islamic Spain. This location, this site, the full name is Nuestra Señora de la Luz y Cristo de la Luz, but commonly referred to as Mezquita Cristo de la Luz. Its Arabic name was Bab al-Mardum, believed to have been built in 999 AD, but clear evidence for that is patchy at best. We're not entirely sure when it was built. This mosque, 81 square metres in floor plan, so it's not a big place of worship. This isn't a big building you're going to be visiting. The Moorish influence is clear from the outside straight away. Umayyad arched high windows made of small bricks. Above the front entrance we see red and yellow bricks in the archways, again make us immediately think of Cordoba and the corresponding emirate and caliphate. More on that a little later. Wider gardens this time, north of the building, probably 5 times the total floor plan of the mosque itself. Inside we've got 4 columns. We're going to walk inside through the very narrow doorway and look up. We see 4 columns and 3 parallel naves inside this converted mosque that is now a church. The capitals on top of these columns and the archways above them, plain white. More recognisably Christian, meaning they're younger. The space here divided into 9 squares, all with vaults modelled on the Mezquita Cordoba once again. Later on, Romanesque and Gothic artworks like icons have been added also. And in 2006, an excavation revealed a 5-metre wide Roman street of granite and a corresponding sewer beneath. We have also recently discovered a Christian cemetery below, which dates between the 12th and 15th centuries. There's no solid evidence that explains the Christian name Nuestra Señora de la Luz y Cristo de la Luz, but the legend, upon entering Toledo in 1085, accompanying Alfonso VI on his conquest of the city, El Cid's horse is said to have knelt down before the mosque and it refused to move. Now, at the time, people did not understand what it was doing. People just saw it as a horse misbehaving. But as people started to explore the site, they noticed behind a partition was said to be a model of Christ hidden away out of view of people visiting the mosque. It is believed that somehow the horse sensed this statue of Christ hidden behind the partition and, being a good Christian horse, knelt in obedience of his Saviour, Jesus Christ, before the actual humans were ever aware of this statue. Of course, it's a legend. I don't really see any veracity in that claim, but there is a little white stone placed on the road outside Cristo de la Luz, where apparently this horse knelt down in reverence of his spiritual saviour. But I want to stop at the Mezquita Cristo de la Luz, not to talk about the Christians, but instead to talk about the Muslims, the Islamic polities that found home in Spain. In 711, this is when the Moorish, the Berber, the Arab, whatever word you want to use, conquest of Spain began. The Umayyad leader from Damascus, Musa ben Nusayr, became the first governor of a land that was then called Al-Andalus. Like I said, in 712, already that's when the Moors arrived in Toledo. Why were they capable of conquering Spain that quickly? Simple answer, compared to the Romans, they inherited administrative networks and paved roads that allowed them to walk quickly across the land. Thus, the Arabic colonization of Spain was far quicker and swifter than the Roman colonization had been. At this time, post-conquest of the majority of the Iberian Peninsula, excluding some of Asturias, there were 200,000 Berbers versus a population of 4 million non-Muslims. Therefore, expulsion and or execution of the non-Muslim population was never going to be practical. It was not in the Umayyad interest. Thus, the Umayyads, these Muslims, had to pursue policies of appeasement, of diplomacy, of cooperation with the pagans, with the Jews, with the Christians that lived in the Iberian Peninsula at the time. Enter the scene one of the most charismatic rulers of medieval Europe, Abdul-Rahman I, born 731 in Damascus, but he was exiled as the Abbasids, a more fundamentalist Sunni Muslim polity, sacked the Syrian city and imposed a fundamentalist rule in what we now call Syria. Abdul-Rahman fled to Islamic Iberia and established the Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba in 756, with its famous mosque built in 784 in 1 year. I'm going to do a separate episode dedicated just to the Mezquita de Cordoba at some stage. Al-Andalus was the name of medieval Muslim Spain. It is, of course, the precursor of what we now call Andalusia. The Umayyads, who were the Abdul-Rahman and the Umayyad elite, held disdain for the Islamic orthodoxy and fundamentalism of the Abbasids. They knew they could not rule a diverse Iberia in a very autocratic way, and therefore they had to be accommodating of the dhimmi. Dhimmi meaning Jews and Christians in this context. It is at this stage where we see the emergence of a word mutharab, a Christian living under Muslim rule, i.e. Arabized. The dhimmi, the Jews, the Christians, in Umayyad Spain, they were free to worship whatever they wanted. They were free to pursue any educational career they wanted. They were not forced to convert to Islam. They did have to pay the jizya, which is the tax that monotheists living in Umayyad Spain had to pay. The pagans were not accommodated so well by the Muslims. However, the dhimmi were forbidden from any attempt to convert Muslims to either Judaism or Christianity. They were not permitted to build new places of worship without express permission. They were not permitted to publicly advertise their faith in the street. But there weren't any trades or professions outside those, of course, in the religious courts that were excluded to the dhimmi. Jews in particular, compared to how they'd been treated under the Visigoths, benefited massively from the arrival of the Muslims in medieval Spain. Thus the dhimmi, the Christians and the Jews, did participate in Islamic life. This is one of the reasons why contemporary Spanish has inherited so much Arabic vocabulary. So what happened? The Umayyad Caliphate, after stretching so far, disintegrated slowly in the 11th century into what are known as taifas. Taifa is something, for a lack of a better description, is a city-state. And Toledo was one of those strongest taifas of this period, again, as a consequence of the fact that it had such strong natural defences against conquest. In 1043, a man called Al-Mamun became the leader of the Taifa of Toledo, investing heavily in arts and culture in the city already renowned for it. His big rival was Sevilla. The Taifa of Sevilla and Toledo were locked in battle to assume the role of leader of Islamic Spain. In this odd world of Taifas, there was a very complex web of relations across the Iberian Peninsula, also crossing religious boundaries. And again, we see the notion of Christians and Muslims locked against each other in an eternal war for rule, for conquest, for governance of the whole of Iberia. And that is what happened later, but it is not what Spain looked like in the 10th and 11th centuries. In fact, the most famed, the most glorious warrior knight of Christian Spain, Rodrigo Diaz el Cid, he was a paid mercenary and in many cases fought for the Muslim taifas. He was not fighting Muslims all his life for the good of Christianity. That's not what he was doing. In fact, the name El Cid, it comes from Arabic, Al-Said, meaning the chief, the lord, the chieftain. Even beyond that, Al-Mahmun, in his desperation to beat the Taifa of Seville, he looked to the Castilian king Ferdinand I for protection, for a military alliance. He used his armies because beating the Taifa of Sevilla was more important to him than vanquishing other Christians in Iberia. Al-Ma'mun ruled Toledo for 33 years, bringing in an era of stability, and the economy and prestige of Toledo flourished at this time. That really blossomed. But again, after his death, the political landscape fractured, with civil war reuniting across much of Al-Andalus as many different leaders, many different Islamic leaders, sought to establish their own interests and conquer as much as possible. Al-Ma'mun's grandson, Al-Qadir, offered Alonso VI refuge from his enemy Sandro Leon, his own brother, in exchange for military protection of Toledo. So we see a Christian king with his own vendetta against his own brother, another Christian, and the grandson of a previous esteemed ruler of a Muslim taifa, working together in the face of conflict against their own co-religionists. This is what medieval Spain looked like. Al-Qadir knew he was unpopular. He knew he wasn't as popular as his grandfather Al-Ma'mun inside Toledo, and many people he knew were conspiring against him. And thus, without Alfonso VI, he knew that it was going to be impossible to remain in power. Thus, 1085, Alfonso VI did not lead a heroic cavalry charge, a siege of Toledo. Rule of Toledo was agreed upon. It was exchanged hands. Alfonso VI made it part of his kingdom, and he assisted Al-Qadir in his escape to Valencia, another taifa that had beef with Seville. Al-Qadir's enemies were frustrated by the fact that they could not get to him and batter him. They besieged Toledo in early 1086, purely out of frustration, but the siege was short-lived. Apparently there were no Christian casualties during the siege. Alonso VI made Toledo his capital, made it the capital of Castile, as it remained until replaced by Madrid by Felipe II. What happened next? Al-Qadir's Valencia, that taifa, became a vassal state to Alfonso. He also sacked Zaragoza and then targeted Sevilla, the most powerful city in the south of Spain. But by that time, a new threat had emerged: the Almoravids. The Almoravids were fundamentalist Orthodox Muslims, and they were hugely disapproving of the way in which the Muslims of the Iberian Peninsula had fraternized and collaborated with the Christians, who they saw as heretics. For the Almoravids, religious purity was a higher priority than simple territory acquisition. They were willing to fight Christians for their beliefs. And it was at Badajoz that Alonso VI suffered his first military defeat courtesy of the Almoravids. The Andalusians saw the Berbers as barbarians, and they were shown contempt. Ironically, Al-Mu'tamid of Sevilla, the great rival of Al-Ma'mun, appealed to Alonso VI for help in getting rid of the Almoravids. The Almoravids were militarily very capable. They consolidated rule over taifa after taifa, building up another strong Muslim polity in the southern third of Spain. That, of course, led to an exodus of the Dhimmi, of the Christians, of the Jews, to cities further north, one of which was Toledo. Alfonso kept Toledo a free city where you could practice whatever religion you liked. And again, the city further flourished in terms of economy, in terms of art, in terms of commerce. It was declared a Christian city by Alfonso in 1088, but immediately after, the mosques and synagogues of the city were not touched. The consequence to this day was a forging of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish architecture and aesthetic styles that are more or less unique to Spain alone. The name for this merging of the artistic styles is Mudéjar. From Mezquita Cristo de la Luz, we are going to go back out past the Puerta del Sol and continue our clockwise loop of the northern edge of Toledo city centre. But we're back on Calle Armas. We're going to pass the statue of Federico Martín Bajamontes, the first ever Spaniard to win the Tour de France. We're going to pass the modernist buildings of the Auditorium and the Congress Palace. We're going to pass an excellent Irish pub, that's something I very rarely say, O'Brien's. And here we are once again, almost where we started, the Plaza de Socorro. Where are we going to next? Well, we've spoken about Romans, we've spoken about Visigoths, we've spoken about Jews, we've spoken about the Muslims, but as you all know, Spain is a Christian country. So let's go south, down the Calle del Comercio once again. A 5-minute walk gets us to the Plaza del Ayuntamiento in front of Toledo's Gothic Cathedral. Here the Archbishop's Palace flanks the Plaza del Ayuntamiento in front of the main facade of said cathedral. And at this point in our story, Toledo at last becomes irrevocably Christian. We said medieval Spain under the Umayyads and to a lesser degree under Alfonso VI was a place in which the narrative of a religious war of civilizations does not make sense. That changes. And that changes in the 12th century. as a consequence of two specific events. One, we've already discussed, is the Almoravid arrival, invited by Al-Mu'tamid Sevilla, who later regretted what he was doing. The Almoravids were religious fundamentalists, hell-bent on a war against the heretics, the Jews and the Christians. The other factor that influences a later war of Christians versus Muslims is the emergence of the culture of crusade. Christians from across other parts of Europe decided to take it upon themselves in the later years of the 11th century to perform, in the final 5 years I believe, to perform crusades to take Jerusalem back from the lands of heretics. I think it was first taken in 1099. These two cultural shifts, of course, had an influence on the way in which people inside Spain interpreted their own lives and indeed their relations with other polities. And from this stage, the reconquest began, culminating in 1492, as we've discussed, with the successful defeat of the Nasrid dynasty in the final Islamic stronghold that was Granada. So the Gothic Cathedral of Toledo, construction first begun 1226, took over 250 years to complete, apparently finished in 1492, built over the Al-Hamma Mosque that used to be on this site prior to the beginning of its construction. The right spire of the Gothic Cathedral of Toledo was never completed, so from the outside looking in, it does look a little bit odd. In the words of James Michener in the book Iberia that we mentioned at the beginning, I wonder if there is another church in the whole world whose interior is so rich and at the same time so beautiful. In the book, Michener dedicated many, many pages to Toledo's cathedral and its treasures inside. I'm not going to do that. We're already way into this podcast. Instead, we're going to look at the lives of a couple of people that were instrumental not only in the construction and political relevancy of this edifice, but also who then laid the groundwork for what would become the dominance of Castile in Spanish history later on. Who are those people? Cardinal Mendoza, from 1428 to 1495, and Cardinal Cisneros, the most famous of the two, from 1436 to 1517. The first one, Pedro González de Mendoza. He was the civil governor of Castile from 1482 to 1495 when he died. He was there, he led the armies of Ferdinand and Isabel into Granada, so he gave the armies of the Castile kings at the time the legitimacy and backing from the Catholic Church. He was one of the highest ecclesiastical figures present in Granada when it was sacked in 1492. He was present in court when Columbus presented his wacky proposal to sail west of the Indies. Mendoza had several illegitimate children, but was ultimately forgiven by Rome. Inside the cathedral, we see his tomb, his resting place. It's left of the altar, referring to him as the third king of Spain after Ferdinand and Isabel, which tells you exactly how instrumental he was, not just in the church, but also politically in Spain at the time. But his successor was an even bigger deal in Spanish history, Gonzalo Jiménez de Cisneros, the civil governor of Castile from 1495 to 1517. Joined a convent, and Isabel made him her confessor. She was so impressed by his ability, by his professionalism. She handed him a letter personally that appointed him as the Archbishop of Toledo, whether he liked it or not. He didn't like it. He refused. He did not want to change his position, but she appointed him anyway, giving him a huge promotion in terms of seniority in religious terms, but also political. Mendoza made him a cardinal, and then he was appointed as regent of Castile by Ferdinand when he died in 1516. What does this mean? Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, had been picked as the next ruler of Spain. Cisneros was charged with overlooking governance of the entire empire while they waited for Charles to arrive. He resisted the advances of other nobles and other aristocratic figures from other royal houses who tried to vie for the position in the death of Ferdinand and Isabella. He fought to keep the legitimate heiress to the throne, Juana la Loca, the daughter of Ferdinand and the father of Charles V. He fought to keep her off the throne due to her perceived incompetence. That's another person in Spanish history I want to learn more about. Cisneros led the Holy Inquisition in this period. He had Isabel's backing to expel Jews from Spain in 1492. He invested in Spain's maritime capabilities, transforming it into the most fierce fleet of the entire Occidental world. And he founded a university at Alcalá de Henares, of course at the time, expressly to continue religious study for people coming after him. Never described himself as king, always knew what his job was, and when Charles V eventually arrived, he allowed the new emperor, the new king, to take his rightful place on the throne, in spite of Juana la Loca's belief that she should have been queen. Cisneros is important in history. He kept Castile intact and powerful in a time of monumental shifts in power, with the discovery of the New World, with all this new treasure which is coming in. It was a period in which the whole of Europe was seeing seismic changes, and he kept it together, not for himself, but in honour of Ferdinand and Isabel, who had given him his first shot and given him the ability to rise in power. The street that runs by the cathedral has his name to this day. So we're going to walk back along Calle Comercio to the Circulover, and we're going to visit two more sites before we end our quick walking tour of Toledo. The first one, we go through the Arco de la Sangre, past the Miguel de Cervantes statue, to the Museo de Santa Cruz. Advertising itself as one of the primary museums in the entire city, the Museo Santa Cruz is a former hospital commissioned by Cardinal Mendoza, that man once again. And in 1919, it was decided that the former Provincial Museum of Toledo, which had been nomadic, it had no site, had no permanent headquarters. It was decided in 1919 that the Santa Cruz Hospital would be converted. The conversion took place in the 1930s. We have Visigothic remains, we have Moorish art, we have Christian statues, we've got things from Romans in there as well. Dedicated primarily to art, archaeology and ethnography, the Museo Santa Cruz offers you a very good quick insight and overview of the various eras of Toledo history. We've even got some El Greco paintings housed inside that have been donated by several patrons, including El Prado Museum in Madrid, not too far away. It's essentially nowadays a two-storey building surrounding a typically Moorish patio and gardens that is well irrigated with tiled floors and alcoves all around it. Rooms off the patio contain many things to see, many relics, many treasures placed against the walls, lining downstairs galleries around the garden. We've done an excellent job so far of looking at the key eras of Toledo's history, but one thing we haven't done is talk about the modern history, the 20th century. Let's do that now by leaving the Museo Santa Cruz, walking a couple minutes to the south, and going to El Alcázar de Toledo and the Museo del Ejército, Spain's Army Museum. So the Alcázar, used by the Romans, the Visigoths and the Moors as a vantage point due to its high altitude. The Alcázar to this day, the big square building you see, imposing, rigid, heavy, austere, but with a very powerful exterior. Each corner has its own tower with dark metal spires on top. It is not a building that you could ever describe as pretty. Impressive at a stretch, but it is foreboding. The purpose of it is to inspire fear. Inside there is a very grand courtyard, far more redeeming in terms of appearance and aesthetic, with a huge statue of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, in military uniform on horseback in the centre of this patio. The Alcázar is a former barracks. It was used as a barracks in the early 20th century, and it was almost empty in 1936. And it is this era where we have the best story of the Alcázar, what is now known as the Siege of the Alcázar of Toledo. In 1936, the colonel of the infantry based in Toledo was José Moscardó Iriarte. We're going to call him Moscardó from now on. He was a Franquist, he was a right-winger. He, knowing the Republicans were coming, summoned all military staff in the area, in the district, and some Guardia Civil nearby to the Alcázar to hold station in anticipation of the Republicans arriving, which they did, and the siege began. July 21st, 1936, death count so far, 1,205 fighting men, military men. There were also 555 civilians killed as a consequence, 211 apparently of which were children. The military, the pro-Franco forces, the Guardia Civil stationed inside the Alcázar had very little in the way of food and water. They could obviously not leave to go get some. Moscardó, the colonel, instructed everyone to remain in the Alcázar no matter what and defend. For 10 weeks in total, the Republican forces sieged the Alcázar, trying to break it down, trying to destroy it, trying to smash the resistance. They used artillery, they used planes dropping bombs, but eventually, legend has it that on the third day of the siege, Republican forces got hold of Moscardó's son, Luis, and got him on the phone to his father inside the Alcázar. Luis was the one to explain to his father that if they did not surrender, his son would be executed. Moscardó, a religious man, commanded his son to give his soul to God, shout Viva España, Viva Cristo Rey, and die with honour. But it's not true. Records show that Luis Moscardó was alive in Madrid years later, so the story is clearly apocryphal. How did the Republicans respond? After using artillery and planes to drop bombs on the Alcázar, they employed miners from Asturias to bring explosives and dig a tunnel below the Alcázar where those explosives would be planted. Moscardó was told of the plan. He was given a final warning and a final chance to surrender the Alcázar, but he remained as resolute as he ever was. Thus, at 6:30 in the morning, 31 past to be exact, on the 18th of September 1936, the Alcázar blew up and the southwest corner of the building was destroyed. The photo evidence of the blast, which you can see in the Museo del Ejército Español, it is unbelievable, the size of that explosion. Literally, the second the thing exploded, someone took a photo. Terrifying to behold with your own eyes. The explosion was heard 40 miles away in Madrid. After the southwest corner was destroyed, the Republicans began to climb across the rubble to get to the people still inside who were alive, but they were not successful. On the 28th of September, Franco's troops arrived in Toledo and destroyed the Republican forces there. As mentioned, the Alcázar now contains the Museo del Ejército Español, very unkeeping with the rest of the city. It's modern, it's functional, it's glass. The museum itself, just not in keeping with the strong, austere appearance of the Alcázar and much of the city, I might add. The Alcázar has 4 floors, T1, T2, each with a floor in the middle. T2 is where the courtyard with the statue of Charles V is located. Above T1, T2, we have H1 and H2. There is no central courtyard here. They just go around in a square shape around the big space in the middle. After you enter, there's a cafe, there's an auditorium, there are meeting rooms, there are toilets, there's a reception desk, the normal things in a museum. And the exhibitions are built into these walls of the Alcázar. It is thorough. It gives a very detailed account of the history of Spanish warfare on a battle-by-battle basis, generally speaking starting in the 16th century with the formal establishment of the Spanish army, much of which discusses the actions performed in the Americas, even by my standards. And I love a long visit of a museum. There is so much information. Unless you are really into military history, it's probably a little bit overwhelming. Other exhibits inside the museum, they explore types of engagement, siege warfare, urban warfare, warfare in jungles, that sort of thing, a history of military insignia, a history of uniforms, war in literature, photography, military journalism, war toys, toy soldiers, that sort of thing. Quite frankly, I preferred the story of the Alcázar more than the visit. We have completed our walking tour of Toledo. We have explored its history, the amazing men and women who made history here and made it such a interesting, unique city. I love the city, and I totally get, now having been, why it attracts so many tourists. It absolutely needs to be a place you get to see at some point, and hopefully this podcast episode, has done something to convince you to visit when you can. Our final segment, again, the Spanish recommendation of the week. Mentioned at the beginning, this week our recommendation is the book Ornaments of the World, How Muslims, Jews and Christians Created a Culture of Tolerance in Medieval Spain by Maria Rosa Menocal. It's difficult to get hold of good writing about medieval Spain. That is not of the Christian side of things. But this book gives an excellent insight into the late Umayyad dynasty and the cultural output that came as a consequence of their politics. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for listening to the Hispanophiles podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, all those good things. But most importantly, have a fantastic day, and I hope you can join us once again soon.